only about just building the infrastructures, building the boulevards and all of those houses you still see in Paris if you go down the Boulevard Sebastopol or wherever, you know. It wasn't only about that. The other thing that was going on was that actually the whole matter of daily life was being transformed by the way in which a new society was being built, and new consumerism, and much of it around the notion of spectacle, was also being constructed. For instance, the court. Napoleon made a very glamorous court, but he absolutely insisted that the old uniforms be thrown away and everybody wear a complete new design of court attire. Now this, of course, led all of the seamstresses in Paris to move from a situation of unemployment to full employment over a period of about 6 months. And then the fashion industry kicks in, and suddenly people are going on with vast crinoline dresses and all this kind of stuff you see in Monet paintings, you know, crazy kind of stuff like that. And they're parading on the streets, so the spectacle, and then the department stores come in, and the gas lighting comes in, and suddenly Paris becomes a great tourist centre, the city of light, and the whole kind of lifestyle, and the opera, and all this sort of stuff. In other words, you're not merely talking about the reconfiguration of the physical infrastructure, you're also talking about a transformation of lifestyle which has political consequences. And here I think there's another theme which becomes very important to me, which is the way in which the transformation of urban environments has real serious impacts upon political consciousness and political thinking. If you unleash the dialectic that Marx talks about when he says, well, in making the world we make ourselves, if you make the world a certain way, you make yourselves in a certain way. The interesting question was, to what degree was the remaking of the Parisian world about remaking of self, and in the remaking of self, remaking of political subjectivities? And actually the big contest over political subjectivities in Second Empire Paris was there. And there was, if you like, a revolt at the end of the Paris Commune, which is an attempt to actually attack the new forms of political subjectivity that were taken up in the new consumerism that was there in the Second Empire. So all of this is connected then to emerging from, using urbanization to emerge from the crisis. Now, I have argued that this is a terribly important issue, that the way in which the problems of the 1930s were resolved after 1945 was largely through suburbanization of the United States and Robert Moses and all the rest of it, which was not only about building infrastructures and building the suburbs, it was also about a transformation of lifestyle and a transformation of the kinds of commodities which people needed to fuel that lifestyle. And of course it carried with it certain transformations of political subjectivities, which we're still living with today, because if you want to look at some of the areas of political reaction, where do you go? So it's, this is a world which is constructed, and I say to my students, everybody has this notion that there's an infinite appetite for trinkets and baubles, as Adam Smith once said, but how come the trinkets and baubles include the category lawnmower? And in 1945, if you were a smart entrepreneur, you'd start making lawnmowers, and pretty soon you'd see everybody trolling around mowing their lawns, and there's no collective lawnmower down the end. So this is a very important process. And guess what? To the degree we're coming out of the crisis this time, what is happening in China? You have a huge infrastructure investment project in China. There is a huge urbanization project in China. Shanghai property prices doubled last year. There's a huge speculative boom going on in the urban environment in China. This is a classic way in which you get out of crises. And to some degree, we see this during the 1970s and 1980s, a transformation in the nature of urbanization, which is very much about absorbing surplus capital through urbanization projects that are very much about gentrification, condominium construction, and all the rest of it. And I always kind of parallel Mike Davis's tale about cities of slums. Every city I go to that's supposed to be a city of slum has a huge kind of construction project going on, condominiums all over the place. You're in Mumbai or somewhere like that, and you see these things powering all over the place. And in Santiago in Chile, and there's this whole area called Little Manhattan there, and so everywhere you go, the cities have been construction sites. But it's not only construction sites, it's also been about the transformation of lifestyle. And my favourite thing here was, in the 1960s, you would not see a sidewalk cafe in New York City. Now the place is littered with them, and why on earth anybody would want to sit in a cafe on 2nd Avenue? Traffic roaring past you, you know, and pretending you're seeing some nice little Parisian kind of corner. What fantasy world are you in? And, you know, and everybody yells about smoking, but what about fumes? Petrol fumes and diesel fumes are surrounding it. Anyway, so no, I mean, look at the cafe, the sidewalk cafe culture in New York City, and this is also about turning the street into a site of spectacle, much as happened in Second Empire Paris. So that, you know, you see all these young kids, you go down to the village, you see all these young kids parading around in fashions, and everybody has to have a new. You know, I've got a 20-year-old daughter. I know what this is like. And she goes down. She goes down to the village with the same dress 3 nights running, and she's dead, you know, and she just find another one, you know, how awful. But this is the world that gets constructed. So the transformation of urbanization is integral to all of this process. But the downside of it is, and the interesting side, that one of the reasons why investments in urban infrastructures and investments in urban transformation are so easy, so good, is because it takes a long time to figure out whether they're productive or not. But they take a long time to build, and they take a long time to come online, and it takes 8 or 10 years before you figure out whether you've done a good thing or not. And during that time, you know, you just sit there waiting and hoping that, you know, the development's going to come, and people are going to come into the condos, and they're going to settle in the new shopping malls, or they're going to come to the new, you know, multiplexes or whatever. So it takes a while for all of that to sort of settle down and figure out whether things are working or not. And generally what happens is that there comes a point where it becomes clear in many instances that there's been serious overproduction, overaccumulation in the urban process. And the urbanization process has gone too far too far. And when that happens, you get a crisis which attaches to a crisis originating out of this investment strategy in urbanization. Now, this point gets overlooked again and again and again. I hear a lot, for example, about this is a subprime crisis. And I kind of say, no, it's not a subprime crisis. This is a crisis of urbanization. And you should look at it in terms of a crisis of urbanization. And we've been through this, by the way, before. For example, only just recently, just in about the last 6 months, there have been 2 major research studies which have come out of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which has gone back and looked at the role of real estate investment in the 1920s. And guess what? Speculatively, real estate investment in the 1920s took off. It was an asset boom, and it was highly located, and particularly in commercial property. It was basically New York and Chicago, and that was it, and a few other small places. And most of that went bust about a year to 6 months before the big crash of 1929. And so, and then in housing, the same thing happened. So there was a housing boom, which went on in the 1920s, which was absorbing the surplus capital, and the housing boom collapsed. And then the commercial property boom collapsed just shortly after the housing boom collapsed. And what these researchers say is, you know, if we had been aware of this, and if writings about the Great Depression had understood the role of all of this leading into the Great Depression, policymakers would never have allowed the housing boom to go on in the way it did, and Greenspan would never have said the kind of things he said about, oh, this is just a bit of froth in a few housing markets. No, he would never have said it. He would have said, this is a dangerous situation. But the irony is, it's always been a dangerous situation. You know, when people go back and they look at the crash of 1973, you know, the general story is, well, it was all about oil and oil price, and it was the war, you know, in the October War and the oil embargo and the oil price hike that caused the crash. No, the crash was going at least 6 months before that in property markets. And you know,